Module 8, Special Instruments. Everything so far assumed money buys assets, and the assets appear in a cost table. Policy-based financing, working capital, and intermediated financing do not work that way. The adaptation methodology addresses each separately. Two framing statements come from the methodology itself. First, it calls this section an initial framework. It is explicitly not settled doctrine. Second, and more important, attribution for these instruments is still based on the three-step approach, further clarified to reflect the nature of these financial instruments. The three steps do not go away. Context of vulnerability, intent, and a clear direct link remain the test. What changes is what each step attaches to. Start with policy-based financing. The methodology describes it as supporting national and subnational programs of policy reforms and institutional actions. Financing is made available as non-earmarked general budget financing upon satisfactory implementation of the overall reform program, which includes a set of critical policy actions. Non-earmarked is the crucial word. The money is not tied to a purchase, so there is nothing to disaggregate in the usual sense. The policy actions, agreed in advance between the bank and the government and set out in the project documents, become the unit of analysis. The three steps restate onto the policy actions. The operation sets out the vulnerability context on a robust evidence base, together with the adaptation activities needed to strengthen the recipient's policy and institutional framework. It sets out the explicit intention to develop policy actions consistent with that context and with relevant adaptation strategies. And the actions included must directly contribute to addressing the identified vulnerabilities or to enabling adaptation. If those three criteria are met, the methodology is specific about the method. Climate adaptation finance is estimated at the policy action level and using a proportional approach. Adaptation finance is allocated to each policy action that articulates a clear and direct link between the vulnerability context and that specific action. Two things follow. The assessment happens action by action, not program by program, and the incremental approach is not offered here. The methodology names the proportional approach for this instrument. Next, working capital. The methodology defines it as finance provided to an entity for operational expenditures and sets the test for when it counts. Working capital is considered to contribute to adaptation if it leads to, enables or supports the implementation and operation of adaptation activities. Its three steps differ in one important way. The vulnerability context is set out for the recipient's business model. Intent is shown by the recipient conducting adaptation activities, holding sustainability certifications that require practices reducing climate vulnerability, or producing products or services that enable adaptation. The third step is not about the link at all. It is capacity of the recipient. It is institutional capacity to report on those activities, certifications, or product information, or a commitment to build it. That is a different kind of test. For working capital, the methodology asks whether the borrower can actually report on what it is doing. An entity with adaptation activities but no capacity to evidence them does not satisfy the third criterion. If all three are met, adaptation finance is estimated as the finance associated with the adaptation activities in the recipient's business model, using a proportional or an incremental approach, based on the operational expenditures associated with those activities. Third, intermediated financing. This is money provided through banks, non-bank financial institutions, funds, or other intermediaries. The methodology names the central difficulty directly. For intermediated operations, there is often a high level of uncertainty on the use of proceeds in advance. You may be assessing subprojects that do not exist yet. Its criteria are reshaped again. The recipient must understand vulnerabilities and adaptation activities within the geographical and sectoral scope of the transaction, drawing on adaptation plans or an assessment developed by the bank. It must hold a preliminary pipeline or initial list of activities covering that scope. Or, where none exists, undertake to develop one, with that commitment reflected in the financing agreement and realized by the time the finance is fully utilized. And it must have the capacity to identify and report on adaptation activities, evidenced by dedicated responsibility for adaptation, a climate risk management system, disclosure of physical climate risk, or similar processes. Then two calculation routes exist, depending on what is known. When the use of proceeds is known, adaptation finance is estimated as the percentage of finance associated with adaptation activities included in the initial project pipeline. When the use of proceeds is undefined, the bank may estimate adaptation finance using a projected allocation to activities that contribute to adaptation, as committed in the financing agreement. The methodology's own examples of an undefined use of proceeds are a pipeline still being developed at approval or a general credit line. That projection may be based on the percentage of the recipient's existing investment portfolio financing adaptation activities at the moment of the transaction, a client survey, or a market assessment. And it adds a follow-up obligation. The bank will periodically verify actual disbursements to inform future similar operations. A projected allocation is permitted, but only with a commitment in the financing agreement behind it, an evidenced basis for the percentage, and verification afterwards. A client's expectation that roughly a quarter will be green satisfies none of those three. Now, what this methodology does not settle, and where to look instead. It states that the multilateral development banks will continue to work together to further develop approaches for tracking adaptation finance in other instruments, such as guarantees, equity, and results-based financing. For those, the adaptation methodology gives you nothing. But the annual joint report does, in its annex on types of instruments, and this is the part of the reporting system most consultants never open. The pattern that annex establishes is worth stating on its own, because it resolves a confusion that runs through instrument work. The eligibility methodology decides what qualifies. The instrument definition decides what base the percentage is applied to. Two different documents, two different jobs. For a bond supported by an MDB, only the percentage of proceeds that are used for activities included in the joint MDB tracking methodology counts as climate finance. The base is proceeds used, not face value. Improvising a face value rule overstates the amount, often by a great deal. For investment loans, proceeds used for activities included in the joint methodology count. For lines of credit, a credit line provides a guarantee that funds will be made available, but no financial asset exists until funds have been advanced. Climate finance is the proportion of the credit line committed to eligible activities. For working capital, the definition matches the adaptation methodology. Advisory services are treated differently again. What is tracked is the cost of managing the program, including staff time, studies, and training. Record the instrument, its reporting base, the unit of analysis, the eligibility test applied, the allocation rule, whether the figure is ex ante or ex post, the evidence, the verification plan, and who approved it. The eligibility test comes from the methodologies. The reporting base comes from the joint report. Keeping them in separate columns is what stops the two being confused. Module 9 turns to a system that answers a different question entirely.